Hello there. So with the recent news about the ancient writing that implies Jesus may have had a wife, and with the upcoming Easter holiday, I was initially going to make a video asking the question, was Jesus married? But then I realized that's not actually what anybody cares about. The controversy over the question of whether Jesus was married isn't actually about whether Jesus was married. The real controversy is over the question, did Jesus, at any point in his life, ever have sex? For the purpose of this video, I am going to assume that everything said in the New Testament about Jesus is true. I'm going to, as most Christians do, ignore the contradictions in the Gospels and whatnot, and I'm just going to assume that generally what it says is true. And in doing so, I'm going to say that there is nothing in the New Testament that actually even implies that Jesus was not married or did not have sex. But given the historical context, I will essentially consider the two things to be one and the same. That if he had sex, he got married. If he got married, he had sex. If I were a Christian, a historical Christian in 1st, 2nd, 3rd century, I would probably assume that Jesus got married. It was common practice at the time. Basically, you became an adult and got married. And it probably wouldn't be too controversial. The Bible never mentions it. But it also never mentions whether any of the apostles were married. It never mentions any of their wives. It never mentions whether they had children. However, if what the Bible says is true, then at least one of the apostles was married, Peter, because he had a mother-in-law. It's pretty hard to get a mother-in-law without also having a wife, if you're a man. So, at least one of the apostles was married, but the Bible never mentions his wife, never mentions if he has children, never mentions any of the other apostles' wives, and it also doesn't mention whether Jesus had a wife or not. Apparently, the men who were writing the Gospels did not consider it important to say whether Jesus was married or not. It really didn't matter to those guys. Now, taking myself out a little bit from this assumption that everything the Gospels say is true, the Gospels were written to tell particular stories about Jesus, to make points. And whether Jesus was married or not was not apparently one of the things that was important to the people who were writing these narratives about Jesus. Now I'm going back into the story of assuming everything said about Jesus is true. At the time, within a few hundred years of Jesus' time, it probably wouldn't have mattered much to those people. And if you could go back in a time machine and ask them whether Jesus was married or not, you would probably find a good number of people who assumed that he was. Just like people today would assume that Jesus pooed. They don't think about it. But if you were to ask the average Christian, do you think Jesus pooed and peed? Well, they might find the idea somewhat offensive, thinking about Jesus pooing and peeing. But if you put them on the spot, most would say, well, yeah, he was a man, so he pooed and peed. The view historically would be essentially the same for getting married and for having sex. He was a man, he pooed, he peed, he ate, he slept, he got married, he had sex, because that's what men do. Over the course of the development of Christianity, over the centuries after Jesus' time, views of sex changed. Within the church, it came to be that essentially all sex was bad. The only excusable sex, still bad, but excusable sex, would be sex for the purpose of procreation. You could not have sex for any other reason without it being a sin. And even within that context of having children, there has been at times even like this religious concept that, you know, you can have sex to have children, but you should try not to enjoy it. And you should ask for God's forgiveness for having sex. even though you were doing it within the one allowable framework for having sex. So as this idea of sex as a bad thing, as a dirty thing, entered Christianity, that's when the idea of Jesus being married would start to be more controversial and more objectionable to Christians, because they wouldn't want to think of their perfect God-man having sex, which is dirty and sinful. So in order for Jesus to be perfect and a God-man, he also had to be celibate. So then, reading these narratives about Jesus, which say nothing about whether he was married or not, because the writers didn't think it was important whether he was married or not. They sort of wrote in between the lines, no, Jesus was never married, because we can't have Jesus having sex. Now, in the modern times, people have gone back and re-examine questions about whether Jesus was married, whether Jesus was gay, which, by the way, there's actually also no reason to believe that Jesus was or was not gay. Even if he was, there was historically no such thing as a gay man at the time. There were men who liked to have sex with other men, but they still tended to marry women and have families, because that's what men did. The social outlook was just different. For instance, in the Greek and Roman empires, at different times in different situations, it was acceptable for men to have sex with each other, but those men still typically married women and had children, because that was what was done. So it is almost certain, really, assuming that Jesus did exist, that he did some of the things the Bible implies and says he did, that he lived to be, into his adult years and had this religious and social movement form around him. He was probably a relatively normal man. He probably had a wife, may have had children, and odds are Jesus had sex. But no Christian wants to think that now. Anyway, thank you for watching. If you have any thoughts, feel free to comment below. I hope you'll subscribe and like and watch other videos. And if you have any thoughts on any videos you see on this channel, if you would like to see more videos like that or fewer videos like that, feel free to post those thoughts too. Thanks for watching. Until next time.